Hello, this will be the first video tonight. I'm going to go through and show a couple of different masks in Photoshop. The first one that I will work on are some star masks for M27. Uh, Typically you want to use a star mask to avoid oversaturating your stars, blowing out the cores, getting the big halos around them. The subs that I took for this M27 were 8 minutes long, so the stars are already pretty bright. You can see if I zoom in here, there's a little bit of blue color, but the centers are already blown out. So we're going to have to be very careful with stretching this image so that we don't blow any more of those stars out. So to get started, I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm just going to do a couple of quick stretches. You can see very quickly more details being brought out. But the other thing that you can see is that these stars are getting really white, really bright. And we don't want these getting too white, so I'm going to do one more stretch here. And this is where I'm going to make my mask. So what happened, I can zoom in here nice and close, is that you can see the big halo is already starting to show up around some of these stars, especially these really bright blue stars. You kind of want to keep these nice compact round disks, and instead it's turning into kind of a really fuzzy halo. There's a couple ways that we can take care of that, and the way that I'm going to take care of the first star mask is going to do a selection of color range. When you go to a color range, you can see what it's going to do is it's going to pick things based on how bright they are. Typically, if you click on this left-hand dropper, you can click on a star towards the center of it, and you can drag this fuzziness slider back and forth. If I drag it all the way to the left, it's not going to pick any of these stars, and if I drag it all the way to the right, it's going to pick a good bit of them, but I want to pick a few more stars than what it initially picked, so I'm going to go to a little smaller, less bright star, and I'm going to click on it with the plus button. And it's going to add a few more stars, and I actually want a few more than that, so I'm going to go to even fainter star, and I'm going to click on that. So that looks about right. So I'm going to hit OK, and you can see what it did is it selected all of these really bright stars. Anything that has a really bright region, it selected that. And it also selected some of my nebula, which I do not want to be selected. So what I can do is go in here and I can deselect some of that. So I'll go to my lasso tool, hit the Alt button, hold it down, and there's a couple stars that I don't want to get rid of in here. You can see these little spots, but I do want to get rid of this brighter nebula that it's selected. So I'm just going to hold the Alt button down and carefully select out that brighter nebula, and you can see it disappear. Okay, so we've now only got stars selected like we want. You can see the very brightest part of that is a little bit blown out. Not too bad, but here's one that's really bad. But it only selects sort of towards the towards the middle of the star, and it doesn't select the outside of the star. So what I want to do is I actually want to go in here to select, to modify, and to expand. Typically for stars, I think about 3 pixels is a good expansion. But I also don't want a hard line on here, and you can see now that I am well outside of my stars. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to feather these selections, so that way we don't actually have a hard line around the stars. And you can see it's a little bit weird shaped if you keep it like it is. So I will right click inside of one of these selections, I will go to feather, and I'm going to feather by the same amount, 3 pixels. Sometimes you want to feather by the same amount, maybe 2 pixels is fine. You can play with it a little bit. Maybe I'll go to 2 pixels to start with. So I'll select this and watch what happens to the lines around the stars. Become a little bit rounder, and they go in towards the star a little bit more. So now I am going to go up to layer. I'm going to go to layer mask, and I'm going to go to hide selection. So when I hide the selection, you can see what happens is those stars didn't get stretched very much. It does create a little bit of a black halo around them, but we're going to take care of that. I'll show you what the star mask looks like now by selecting Alt and then clicking on that mask. And this is what the star mask looks like. You can see one thing that happened that was a little unintended is that my region around the actual nebula has this really white area in it. We're also going to take care of that right now too, because you don't want any hard transitions like this. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control L for levels, and you got to make sure that you're still within the star mask itself. And I'm going to go all the way to the right, drag this white point slider inside of the hump of of my histogram here. And if I click preview on and off, you can see what it does is it makes the whole background pretty much hard white. So it gets rid of kind of that gray gradient in the background, and it's going to take the mask and it's going to make it so that the mask is really only blocking these darker spots and not the background. That takes care of a lot of what I want to do. The other thing that I want to do so I'm not getting these halos, I'm going to hit OK here, is I'm going to come up to Filter, and I'm going to go to Blur, and I'm going to do a Gaussian blur. And that'll soften up all these hard edges just a little bit more even than that feather. And I'm going to bring this down to about 2 millimeters. Or 2 pixels, I apologize. So I'll hit OK. I'll come back over to my main image so you can see it. And as you can see, there's still a little bit of that kind of ringing around the star. So the next thing that I can do to go ahead and correct that is come back in to my actual star mask, and I can go to levels again, and I can actually drag this middle slider over to the left a little bit. And what it's going to do is it's going to shrink the size of my star mask. You can see if I drag it all the way to the left, it'll basically disappear, but I don't want that. I don't want to make it bigger either, which you can do by dragging to the right, but I want it just a little bit smaller. So it starts at 1, so I'm going to bring it over to maybe 1.35. So it's still blocking out the core with pretty black in the star mask, pretty much black, which is going to block you from stretching the really white part that's already pretty much close to white. I'm going to hit OK, and I'm going to go back to my main image. And now you can see those halos are just about all the way gone. So I'm pretty happy with what that did. One thing that you want to be a little careful with is, especially inside of your nebula, if you aren't careful, you won't be stretching your nebula. You'll get halos in there a lot quicker than you will around your dark background. So you need to be very careful with that. I'm going to actually go back to the star mask, and I'm going to move that slider just a little bit more over to the left, which should help out just a little bit more. And if I zoom in, that really looks a lot better. I'm going to come back into my nebula here, and if you see what I'm looking at here, there's a big stretch, and the color is being developed around the star, but very close to it, there's definitely a little bit of a dark ring around it. So you can come in, especially on nebulas like this that are small and pretty controlled, and you can individually pick these. We'll look at what to do a little bit more later on with larger, more diffuse nebula so that you don't get this effect. Sometimes if you look at images where people add their hydrogen alpha to the image, then they'll have this beautiful red detail, all kinds of crisp, sharp lines for the nebula and sharp details, and then they'll have these stars throughout the nebula that are basically look like they're sitting in their own holes. So to take care of this, we can paint on the image, which I typically don't like to do, but we can also just come back in here and select around this star. And we're going to feather that with about a 5 pixel feather. And make sure that you are clicked on the actual white part of your layer, which is the mask. And then we're going to fill this with white, but we're only going to fill it with about a 75% opacity. And right there you can see what happened. It took care of that. So you're starting to get stretched too much, so it's not way too bright. It got stretched a little bit. If I click the layer on and off, you can see that it got stretched just a little bit, but not too much, but mostly the nebula around it got stretched. That's what we're looking for. Go ahead and do that up here for this one as well. And I will select a feather, 5 pixel feather. Let's reselect that again here. Do a 5 pixel feather. And we'll fill that again with a 75% white. Okay. And once again, you can see the nebula stretched pretty nicely right around it, and the star kept pretty in check. So I'm going to flatten this image, and we'll move on to showing you a similar mask with a couple of new features. And actually, before we move on, one thing that I did not see is actually this little butterfly looking bright spot in the middle here. So I'm going to actually come in here and going to select this entire nebula region. This, I'm going to put a big feather on it, probably about 15 pixels. And I'm actually going to control the levels of just that region by dragging that down even further so that we don't get that hard butterfly. The butterfly being just that kind of bright selected region in the middle there, which we don't want. So you can see that by selecting only that part of the mask itself and dragging the midpoint slider over to the left, I was able to get rid of that kind of stair-step look of a partial stretch and a non-stretch. So that takes care of the first masking for my first hard stretch. You can see there's a lot more nebula brought out. The stars stayed under pretty good control throughout the image. Not much change in them. They didn't get way brighter. They didn't end up with a big halo on them. It stayed pretty much the same. That's what we're looking to do. Typically, I'll do that for quite a few of my stretches. I'll go in and stretch one at a time, do a couple layer stretches and do that, and then I'll do a couple curve stretches and I'll do that. And I'll show you my next masking technique after this. So I'm going to flatten the image, and we're going to create a new layer. And this time we're going to deal with noise. As you can see, some noise was brought up through all of this. And to deal with the noise, what I like to do is actually, I usually try and address it in very small increments throughout my entire image processing session instead of going all the way till the end and trying to remove a bunch of really blotchy noise and really harsh noise, because you're just not going to really be able to deal with it all at once if you have a lot of noise, especially when you're using DSLRs. So one way that you can actually deal with that is you can copy your image and I'll copy it by doing CA and Control A and Control C to get a copy of it. I'm going to create a new layer mask. I'm going to Alt and click into this mask, and I'm going to paste my image in here. And you can see as I pasted my image in here, it's just a black and white version of my image. And since I want to deal with the noise here, you can see that my stars are selected, my nebula is selected, but all the noise is in the actual background. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to invert this. And by doing image adjustments and invert, you can see what I was able to do. Take all the white and flip it to black. And similar to before, we don't want to be including much of our nebula in this. So I'm going to come into with my lasso tool and select around the nebula, and I'm going to feather that as well with about a 15 pixel feather, and I'm going to selectively move that midpoint slider over. I'm sorry, this is the opposite. Since it's noise reduction, we don't want to be actually reducing the nebula here. We only want to be reducing the background and not the stars. So to deal with that, I'm going to be moving the midpoint slider over to the right to actually darken up the layer mask for my nebula. So not only am I going to create a levels mask inside of this area, I'm going to deselect this area now. I'm going to bring this white slider over even a little bit more so that we're really attacking the noise of the background. And okay, I'm actually going to do a slight curves on this portion of the nebula. I'm going to feather it again, and by doing Control M, I can do a curves. And I'm going to come in here and I'm going to select one point in here by hitting Control and selecting that point. And I want to make it darker. So typically, when you're doing curves, you would stretch it up like that to get your target a little bit lighter and bring out more details. But what I want to do is actually make it darker since we're in an inverted screen here. So I'm just going to bring that down a little bit, and you can see that there is some noise actually in the nebula here. You can see that same pattern of noise that's all throughout the background. So I'm actually happy to take care of a little bit of that. And there's not too much noise right in this region, so it's a lot darker. And it won't be affecting the details right there inside the nebula as much. So if I come back over to my image, nothing's been done yet. Just created a mask. And now I can do usually I'll run like a Noise Ninja or something else. But you can see what this is going to do is it's going to really reduce the background noise, but it should not be touching much of the nebula. And it seems like it did a pretty good job. There's still a little bit of noise remaining. The detail in the nebula did not get too much softer. It's practically imperceptible except for down at the, or up at the top of the nebula. You can see there's a good bit of noise there, and it does a pretty good job of kind of subtly wiping that away. The background looks much cleaner than before, although maybe we'll go in with a little bit of a more aggressive noise reduction here, and maybe we'll just do one more Noise Ninja run. And looking at the preview screen here and see how this does. So it seemed to do an even better job at the background this time without touching the nebula. One thing you want to be careful with is that Noise Ninja will sometimes make these pretty rough artifacts around your stars. So we're going to come in here to our mask, actually select on that mask again, and I'm going to put even bigger blur on this. And I should have stopped a couple minutes ago. So we're gonna, select that mask again. Once we select that mask again, we're gonna actually increase the size of these stars just a little bit, so that we don't quite get that ringing effect. And if you can see what actually happened to the dumbbell, if you try and bring the midpoint slider over too far, then you'll blacken out the entire dumbbell, which is not what we want to do. So what I'm going to do is put a selection around the entire dumbbell here, and then I'm going to say select inverse, so that way I'm selecting all of the image but the dumbbell. I'm going to do another levels on it, and this levels I'm going to bring just up here past the bottom of the histogram a little bit. Bringing it past the bottom of the histogram will grow the size of those stars just a little bit. And you can see what happened is I actually forgot to feather my selection up here, which I need to do. So I'll go back here and feather it with a 15 pixel feather so we don't have a hard line. And do this stretch one more time. Okay, so this should grow our stars just a little bit and did a great job. So now there are no longer any of those harsh artifacts around the stars. What little bit is left, you can kind of touch up by coming back into this mask and playing with a little more. Maybe you want to stretch it just a tiny bit more. Typically, if I'm going to stretch it a little more like this, you can see it starts getting really dark, so you want to be careful not to stretch it too much. But so if I'm going to stretch it a little harder like that, then came up a little bit more, then I'm going to come in and do another little bit of a Gaussian blur on this, so that everything isn't quite as pronounced, and you don't have these hard edges again. So let's take a look at our image again. That looks pretty darn good, I think. Very few artifacts around the stars. The noise has been dropped pretty much across the image. The dumbbell still seems to have all of that great detail that we're looking for, and so it's kind of how I go through stretching my images, one levels adjustment at a time, and typically I'll do that with curves too, a little bit here and there, and I will go on and actually show you how I do a curve stretch now as well, with another kind of mask that is pretty similar to the one we looked at, but kind of what we're doing is growing our masks each time and growing what we're trying to do with them. So I'm going to flatten the image here, and we will move on to the next mask. So now, now what I would like to do is actually increase the color intensity a little bit in this before I start doing a lot of hard curves on this. And to do that, there's two ways that I bring it out. I won't really focus on the methods that I use to bring it out, but I will focus on the methods that I use to blend in bringing out the color intensity. So the first thing I'm going to do, again, is do a color range selection, and I'm going to keep it pretty much where it's at. I think I want to add a little bit more of this faint nebulosity here. And so you can use that plus button or the minus button to kind of more selectively choose how much of the nebulosity you want to be selecting for your color intensity. So I select that. Yeah, I'm not really thrilled with how much of it selected there, so I'm actually going to come in here and I'm going to add to the selection here by holding down my shift key and just adding a little bit more around the outside here of the nebula. The shift key and the lasso will give you the plus for the lasso, and we'll add more to what you're selecting in here. So there we go. I'm gonna feather this. Actually, before I feather that, sorry, I'm going to create a layer mask the same way that we've been creating the layer mask, and I'll do that by revealing my selection. As you can see, if I select over here, well, the dumbbell is really white, which is not necessarily what we want. We want it to be pretty white, but you can see what happened in the background is it got really gray and has tons of stars in it and all kinds of stuff like that. Typically I'll do them separately, but one thing you can do if you want to increase the color intensity of both your stars and your nebula at the same time is to leave your mask like this. But so like before, if we don't want to increase the color intensity of the background, we're going to this time bring our black point slider up to the middle of the histogram so that we're not really touching much of the background, the black background. But we will be touching the stars and the nebula itself, which is great. That's what we want to do. We don't want these hard edges as usual, so we're going to put on a Gaussian blur again. And typically, like I said, when we're dealing with stars, you want like somewhere between a 1 and 2 pixel radius for your Gaussian blur. And this looks to be pretty good. With about 2 pixels, a little bit less. You have to be a little careful with some of the really brightest stars that you don't get weird effects like this, which is not something you want. So, if we get an effect like that, then I might come in here and select a feather, and we'll call this like a 8 pixel feather based on how big it is. And what we're going to do is actually fill it with white. But we're going to do like a 75% opacity so it doesn't get too much of a hard line. And it still wasn't exactly what we wanted, so we can just come in here with a paintbrush, which I try to avoid generally, but on something like this, once in a while it doesn't hurt to use a paintbrush just for a little spot touch up here. So I'm going to make a very soft hardness and bring this diameter down just a little bit to about that size. And let's make sure we're actually picking white here. And so we do have white. And there we go. Click it like 3 times. And that fixes up that little area. There might be a couple areas in here that are like that. And if you want to be careful about it, then you might go around and select those areas. And now we have to deal with this region in here, which has a really hard line. So we're going to go back to our image, and we will select this region one more time. But we're going to select it with a little bit larger selection. We're going to feather it. We'll put a little bigger feather on this, and we'll fill this with white again. Make sure before you fill it that you're selected on your mask, and keep it filled with white like this. And what should happen by doing that is that you get this little softer gradient kind of around here. It's pretty close to what we wanted. If we come in here to our levels, we can move that up and down like this. Give a little bit more of a feather effect. Just sort of what we want. And then we're also going to pick, if we go back to our image, we're going to pick our color intensity, and that will be under match color. And what you can see is going to happen is that we are increasing our star color, we're increasing our nebula color, and we aren't touching the background, which is really what we're hoping to do. So you can usually use that color intensity pretty strong, up to like 150. And what it should do is it should really bring out a little more color in your nebula here. can see it's kind of goes from being this gray and dark salmon-y looking thing to a little bit bluer. Sometimes you can do those in a series of stretches. Sometimes you can do them all in one stretch, but it also brought a little more color out to our stars here, you can see, which is what we were hoping to do. It wasn't dramatic, and we didn't want it to be too dramatic because the star colors already had some pretty good color in them, and that's why we used that Gaussian blur to keep from really getting too strong of a color thing where we start getting these like Crayola looking stars. So we'll move on to the next step of how we're going to increase the color intensity. For the next step of increasing the color intensity, what we're going to do is convert to a lab color and bring up the color a little bit, and then we're going to bring that layer in as that image in as a layer on top here for our image. So we'll flatten the image, and I'm going to make a new copy of the image by duplicating it. And we'll call this lab color. Okay. And so now we have our lab color, and what we want to do is go into our channels. I'm sorry, we are not in lab color yet. We're just going to change it to lab color through mode. And now we're going to go into our channels, and we're just going to increase the contrast. Again, we can go in more depth on how to increase these color intensities at another point. But we'll go to image, adjustments, hue, saturation. Oops. So by coming into these channels and increasing our contrast and brightness, we can bring up the color intensity a little bit. You can see the red and blue came up a little bit there with that channel. And we'll go over to channel A. We don't want that salmon-y color, so we'll use channel A to kind of bring out a little bit more of the red. And that's about what we're looking for. Okay. The other thing it did is it brought out a little bit more of the blue in these stars, which is also what we were looking for, and a little bit of the red in some of the red stars. So seemed to work just like we wanted to. I'm going to go ahead and change this back to a RGB color, and I'm going to actually copy all of it, and I'm going to come back over to my original picture, and I'm going to paste it on top of my original picture. And you can see it just brought up the color just even a little bit more, which is just what we wanted. However, what we didn't necessarily want was for it to bring up kind of the color intensity of all the background here. It's subtle, but it's there, and again, I'd like to keep the background pretty clean. Instead of letting it get damaged, we'll try and keep it clean as we actually go through processing. So what we want to do is actually use this layer as a color layer, just to increase the color. And then we also want to create another layer mask. And the layer mask that we're going to use is going to be the same thing as we did before, where we take a picture of our image and we paste it into our layer mask. And this time we really want to reveal as much of the nebula as we can, and we would like to reveal enough of the stars to bring some of that color in. So I'm going to actually select the nebula region itself, put a nice feather on there. Maybe we'll even make a bigger feather this time, and gonna create a little bit brighter area there for that. So that way we're getting pretty much all of that color through, which is really what we want to be doing. So we'll go ahead and just bring up the color on that a good bit. And as you can see, we now have nice pretty stars that are well controlled. They don't have giant halos around them. They've got some nice color in them, and our nebula has some nice color in them. So that's how you can actually bring in another image and combine it and just get the best of what you're looking for of that image without actually bringing in too much of the stuff that you don't want. So that'll be that layer mask. And the final mask that I will use for this image is going to be for applying my luminosity layer. So real quickly, I will just create a luminosity layer. Just for the fun of it, I'll do a easy way of doing it for now. Just be to bring out my details real quick. A little bit more of it there. And we'll sharpen this up just a little bit. A couple of high pass filters. And we'll use a soft light and overlay blending method for both of these. And you can see it really ruins the rest of the image, but it does bring out the details well in the actual nebulosity itself. Bring down the opacity just a little bit on both of these. And what I'm going to do is actually come in here and I'm going to desaturate the image just to turn it into a luminosity layer. And to do that, I'm going to flatten the image and come in here and desaturate and turn it into a luminosity. As you can see, there's more details in here and a little bit more of the faint nebulosity, which is what I want to kind of bring in as my extra layer for my image. So what I'm going to do is duplicate this real quick. And we're going to call this the loom layer. Okay. And I'm going to go back to the image I was working on. I'm going to go back to my history here before I started working on it to create the luminosity. And to bring this luminosity in, I don't want to bring the stars in with it. So there's two ways we can do that. And one is we'll just select this image here and we'll copy it. And we will paste it in to the new image. And as you can see, it brought in all of the really sharp stars and the details. But then, even if we just bring it in as luminosity, all of our color is gone. Everything looks nice and washed out. which is not what we want. So we're going to do the same thing again, where we will actually copy the image and we'll create a layer mask with it. Come into this layer mask. We'll paste it in, paste the picture into the layer mask. And what you can see happened is we got rid of most of the background being pasted in, and we controlled what was pasted a little bit better, but we actually lost a lot of our star color here, which is not what we wanted to do. We'd rather keep those star colors. So in this mask, we will come in here and we'll select the mask itself. We will do the same thing we've been doing, which is bring the levels over just a little bit. Let's bring the black point over. You don't want to go too far, you're going to lose most of your details. And then what we want to do is select the inverse of the nebulosity again. I'll try and do a little cleaner selection of that. Select inverse. Oh, first we want to feather this, and we'll give that a 15 pixel feather. Select the inverse, and as you can see, the rest of the image is selected, but not the nebulosity. And then we're actually going to run a dust and scratches filter on this. And what it should do is pretty much get rid of the stars and the rest of the image. And it looks like it did a pretty good job there. That's what we were looking for. We can decrease that threshold just a little bit. Okay. So now we shouldn't be losing too much star color. And then we're going to come in and we're going to select the nebulosity again. And this time we're actually going to select the nebulosity and not the inverse. And we're going to run a small dust and scratches. And we want this radius to be pretty small, just to keep from losing the detail from the actual nebulosity. All we're trying to do is really keep from getting those stars being way too sharp, but keep the details. So that's what we did. Now if we come back over here and look at our image, what we did was we gained some detail in the nebulosity. As you can see, we didn't damage the star colors, and we applied a good luminance layer. So that's going to be it for that image. We could do a lot more to process it, but that covers a handful of different kinds of masks. So I'll just save this and we'll call it M27 processed.